Hello everyone, my name is TheMadScorpyon and welcome to the Void part of the Prismatic Element Breakdown. In these stream of videos, I'll be going over every aspect, every ability, as well as every bit of gear that you can use to better use a specific element when going into the final shape and taking advantage of Prismatic. In these videos, if you don't know, I'll be going over every class individually, and with every individual class, some recommendations of exotic armor to take advantage of the element, as well as some recommendations to not use because they likely won't be available, and then at the end I will go through a list of weapons that you can use to better take advantage of the Void. Before we get into the Hunter gear options, let's take a look at some of their abilities, as well as some of the subclass verbs you will encounter when dealing with the Void subclasses. Starting off, using Mobius Quiver as an example, there is 3 different debuffs you can encounter when using Void. The first being Weakening, where the target takes increased damage and has their movement speed slowed. Afflicted combatants will also have difficulty firing accurately. Suppression happens, and it takes them out of any active abilities and cannot activate any abilities or movement nodes when suppressed. As well, they cannot fire their weapons generally. While suppressed, it also will stun Overload champions at the same time. Volatile makes it so that when they are inflicted with Void energy, they will explode upon taking enough damage. Volatile rounds from any Void weapons will also pierce barrier champions' shields and stun them. That is just a few right off the bat. Now, you will have access to the Deadfall Shadow Shot. It makes it so that they are tethered to the Void, anchoring, weakening, and suppressing them. The Void anchors fired from this version will pull targets towards the impact point and will come trapped and wait for prey. They also have increased range and last longer, so they'll be able to touch more things from the one point they are shot at. From Shadow Shot, there is one other subclass verb that I will attempt to find really quick if I have an option, but one that I definitely know is in existence is Invisibility right here. You vanish from sight and do not appear on radar. While invisible, your radar range is reduced and performing offensive actions will end invisibility. In the PvE aspect, this of course makes it so that anything after a few seconds will lose complete track of you and will stop shooting at you. However, it might not shoot where you were, so fair warning. The last 2 subclass verbs you'll encounter is the Overshield. You become armored with Protective Barrier of Pure Void Light, reducing damage taken from combatants. The Hunter itself has limited ways of accessing this, but there are a few ways. Then as well, there is Void Breaches, which is the Void Pickup. A dimensional rupture teaming with Void energy. When picked up, Void Breaches grant specifically class ability energy, so that is something nifty for Hunters first off. Getting into the abilities that they have of course the only Void ability in the melee department, and that is the Snare Bomb, where it attaches to surfaces, pings radars, and of course will weaken targets on detonation, something useful for a quick bit of extra damage. The grenades, however, is one thing that I don't think a lot of people are excited for, and that is the Magnetic Grenade, which is simple, it explodes twice, it doesn't afflict anything in terms of debuffs on its own. It can be weakened with a variety of fragments. I just don't believe that fragment is available on the Prismatic version of this subclass. With that as well, the aspect it has access to is Stylus Executioner, which I believe was broadened, so more specifically, defeating weakened, suppressed, or volatile targets grants invisibility and True Sight, which I don't think it gives a option for what True Sight is, which is basically see-through walls, if you don't know what it is. But the Prismatic version is actually revamped, so it doesn't have to be any of those specific Void debuffs, it can be any debuff, something to keep in mind for the future. As well, when you're in the Stylus Executioner invisibility, your melee attack, while invisible, will weaken a target, so it's something nifty to just keep track of there. Now, in terms of the Void loadout for Hunters, there is a few non-variables, or I'd just say obvious choices. Orpheus Rig is always a great option. It just straight up makes it returns more energy on your Deadfall Shadow Shot. You don't have to worry about the Mobius Quiver part, just because it is not applicable. It won't be available on Prismatic. And then, as always, there is the Star Eater Scales, which is just a straight-up good one. If you don't know what it does, you gain additional super energy from Orbs of Power you pick up, and while it is full, Orbs of Power can also overcharge your super, giving you extra damage, giving you healing, as well as Overshield, if you get high enough, that is. Then, from the most part, I would always recommend Omni Oculus as well. It's generally good. You gain more smoke bomb charges. You have damage resistance while you are invisibility, and this also applies to any invisibility, like the ones given by Rat King. That also counts if you don't know. While you're invisible, you gain damage resistance while invisible, and you gain melee energy for other people. From there, I would also say Gerfalcon's Harbrick, which works with Stylus Executioner very well. It grants volatile rounds after you come out of invisibility. While you're invisible, defeat a combatant using a finisher, and all your weapons will get bonus damage. There's lots of different perks that is all centered around invisibility. It works really well with Stylish Executioner. Now, one right off the bat I would recommend obviously ignoring is Gwiz Invest, as that works for Spectral Blade specifically, so that won't be something to take advantage of in Prismatic. Of course, from that point, there is obvious choices like Graviton Forfeit, which is a straight-up buff to your invisibility, granting enhanced irritation effects and various other buffs while invisible. And then there is a variety of other things that are just straight-up neutral game exotics that I could recommend. Liar's Handshake, I believe, will be a part of the class item thing, so that's something I can think of. But for the exotic themselves, things like Mechaneer's Trick Sleeves, if you're a fan of sidearms, Assassin's Cowl always, Foe Tracer is applicable to all ornaments, as well as things like Worm Husk if you want slight buffs. From that point, though, there isn't many other Void-specific exotics for the Hunter I could recommend. There is the obvious neutral ones like Frosties for a little bit of ability regeneration, Six Coyote if you want more Hunter dodges, but from there isn't much else that is Void-specific, so let's go ahead and move over to the Titan. And for the Titan side of things, right off the bat, there is an interesting thing because the Titans only have access right off the bat to the new Titan Super, which is the Twilight Arsenal, where you summon axes made of void light that you can throw at your enemies, and at the same time, once your super ends, you can then use them as a melee weapon for the future until, of course, they are expended. Which, from that point, I'm not exactly sure what they would do. I imagine they do apply Volatile, because most abilities do from that aspect, but at the same time might provide overshields when hitting things with it. But of course, we don't know all the specifics, we just know we'll be seen out of trailers. From that point, though, we also get access to the Tall Wall, specifically through Void, if that mattered for anyone, which there is some ways to make use of it, but more on that later. The melee they have access to is the Shield Throw, where hurling your Void Shield at the target, it will ricochet off of surfaces, granting overshield for every hit, which is very nifty for you Titans. And from that point as well, for the Grenade, you do have the original Titan specific, the Suppressor Grenade, which is unique in power and also can obviously suppress anything out of any active abilities, which again includes Loosen Hive. I imagine that might include Subjugators and Agitators if they are mid-stasis or Strand Super. From that point as well, it does stun Overload Champions, so that's always something nifty. And from that, the Aspect is also something we do not have access to, which is something, again, we don't have any details on, which is something called Unbreakable, which is basically you guard with your grenade ability, I imagine, holding it, and then absorb damage and unleashing it into a damage. Think of Handheld Supernova meets Ursa Furiosa walls. From that point, that is pretty much everything that the Titan has access to. It's not that different from base, but it is a bit more limited than I would like. I would like something more like Controlled Demolition or Bulwark, just because that is what I personally made my Titan set up around. Getting into some of the exotics you could look forward to come Prismatic, it is actually a bit of a weird list. Like, one of the first things I would have recommended would have been Doomfangs, but only having Twilight Arsenal, unless this somehow feeds into that description come Prismatic, this is something that won't have any use just because this is all Sentinel Shield and we don't have access to that. But then, of course, there is a lot of neutral game exotics that I would recommend. Of course, like in my last video, I did definitely recommend Severance Enclosure, which I know I have a build about it that makes it gnarly, not to mention just generally melee kills, elemental kills. There is lots of ways to actually still access powered melee kills with this, especially come Prismatic if you do things like the Strand Claws and still work with that. Not to mention Heart of Inmost Light, which is always a go-to, just generally straight up. Again, use all of your abilities and gain ability recharge off of the other ones. However, there is not many lists of specific Void exotics I could recommend for the Titans, because like I said, a lot of the individual ones don't exactly stand out. Like Saint 14 requires a bubble to make use of. Ursa Furiosa requires guarding to make use of, which again, Twilight Arsenal is summoning axes. You don't have your usual Sentinel Shield. So there isn't many things I could recommend, again, that is Void specific. I can only really recommend the neutral games. Alpha Loopy if you just need a little bit of healing. Peregrine Greaves, I would say, but again, you don't have shoulder charge. There is a few more that I could think of maybe, but there isn't anything that exactly stands out. Of course, there's always Syntheseps and things like Mask of the Quiet One. Precious Scars for healing and reviving if you want to spec out a little bit. But unfortunately, there isn't many more things I could recommend for Titans aside from literally just Second Chance, which buffs your shield throw, giving an anti-barrier and weakening, and recharge on stunning champions. This is literally the only thing I could probably recommend specifically for Void come Prismatic and Final Shape. And with our Void Wailing Warlocks, we have, first off, probably the best option I would say on the Void tree, and that is, of course, Cataclysm Nova Bomb, which is the Slova Bomb, if you might know, but basically a large Nova Bomb that when it hits things, will detonate and, of course, split into smaller projectiles, causing way more damage. Probably the better ad-clear version of Nova Bomb, not to mention it is just a quick fire and forget, which is always good. Now, keeping up with Warlocks, I just wanted to mention right off the bat, there is all class abilities that is going to be available in the form of Empowering Rift, Healing Rift, and Phoenix Dive right off the bat. So if you wanted to experiment or just have some straight up options, you will have all available healing and empowering options. Going into the melee, though, you do have access to the Pocket Singularity. Of course, it is the only one you have. Pushing things away, hurling a little ball of void energy, and making them volatile, which, of course, you can take advantage of. However, this doesn't do anything more than just giving them a second bloop to them, to give it a description. And as well, they do have access to the Vortex Grenade on the void side, which is generally a good option for damage over time, and, of course, some armor mods that do restore energy based on tick damage. From that point, the only aspect that we have access to is Feed the Void, which is probably the best one of all of them, because obviously it just makes it so that any of your abilities can activate Devour, and Devour, if you don't know what that is, makes it so that you can feast on energy and basically heal, overkill, grant grenade energy, and extend Devour, which is always great. It's most prevalently available on Warlocks, but it is readily accessible for a few other things aside from that. Unfortunately, I think Warlocks suffer from the same thing Void Titans do, and that's a lot of these specific exotics that they have access to are way more specific. I would recommend Briarbinds, but you don't have access to Void Souls. Same with Nothing Manacles. I might recommend this, but there is no Scatter Grenades on the tree. Although a very easy recommendation is something that, let me just check through all of my stuff to make sure I don't have anything else that I'm not thinking of on me, but of course there is a tried and true that I imagine a lot of people will go to, and that is Nezarec Sin. Any void ability kills will improve your ability regenerate, and this is not specific. If you have a gun that is void damage and you use it on a prismatic class, everything else on your ability list will get boosted regeneration. And that is everything that is not void, of course. So this is probably going to be the top tier pick for all of you trying to run void, at least a little bit of void. From that point, there is, of course, Apotheosis Veil, which recently had a nifty change to it, where basically just using your super gives you lots of buffs, as well as grenade and melee regen. A weird choice, I know, a lot of people wouldn't think of this for anything, but it had done some nifty stuff. And of course, because of Slova Bump, I might recommend Dire Ahamkara, although its ability regen returns is lacking extremely, so it's hard to actually vouch for it. It's an option, though, if you are looking for ideas. One of the odd choices that I would pick for Warlock armors as well is Secant Filaments. I know this one doesn't see many use of meta nowadays, but while in Empowering Rift, you gain Devour, and damage dealt by any of your allies in the Empowering Rift can overload champions, which is a nifty thing, but then again, we don't know how many champions we'll be dealing with come final shape, so that is just an option there. However, after Secant Filaments, I would probably say that there is many neutral game exotics you can use, Chromatic Fire being among them, Transversus Steps if you're on the more Crucible-based crowd, but like I said, things like Briarbinds, Nothing Manacles, even Controverse Hold for Warlocks, I would recommend them if they were usable. However, I don't think this is going to be usable just because it doesn't give you the charging grenades. You have to use the aspect that allows you to use it. From that point, again, I would probably just recommend any of the neutral game exotics, the Stag, Nezarec Sin, Eye of Another World, Verity's Brow, maybe Ahamkara if you want to double bloop things, even Necrotic Grips if you're using one of the Weapons of Sorrow. There is many options here you can go with. Unfortunately, none of them are many void-specific ones. Moving into the weaponry, you'll probably hear this in every video just because obvious is obvious, but then there is Traveler's Chosen if you just want pure ability energy. Obviously, any kills you make will grant stacks, and the stacks you can convert to ability energy afterwards. There is almost no argument whether or not this is one of the best for ability uptimes in Destiny 2. Of course, you do have to deal with using a sidearm in your exotic slot, which I know a lot of people aren't exactly itching for. Then from that point, there is lots of options. Graviton Lance is good at ad clear. Of course, there is Hardlight and Borealis if you want those weapons to just make void. Telesto has always been an option, even though it might not be there. Wave Splitter can also suppress once you gain an Orb of Light. Leia Monarch can overload champions and is always a solid option for PvE and poison spreading. And there is a modicum of other options. The Titans can, of course, use the Edge of Action for some extra overshields. Manticore has been in a good spot recently. And, of course, Collective Obligation is the king of slinging Void debuffs, which I would hope that it can go outside of Void come Prismatic, or at least they give it the one exception while using a Prismatic subclass, because unless you spec out for, if you spec out for Void specifically, this will be a monster. But otherwise, it will be nigh useless otherwise. And lastly, there was something I wanted to mention earlier. There is Buried Bloodline, which, of course, if you don't know what that is, basically just dealing damage and defeating targets will grant you Devour, and at the same time, when Devour is active and you have the Catalyst, it will weaken targets, which is just a straight up another version of Collective Obligation that is a little bit easier to maintain, I would say, in a bit of a hard-hitting pocket pistol form. From there, on the Void side, there is some things that I would actually keep in mind. I would look out for Colony. This is actually getting a buff come Final Shape that will turn it into a weird version of Viced Outbreak Perfected, so something nifty there. Black Talon has been a weird one just because it's Void, but at the same time doesn't really do much. Two-Tailed Fox, of course, can suppress with its Void Rocket, so there is an option for you. Then there is Truth that is getting a buff, but it doesn't seem to be there. There is Leviathan's Breath, which does make things volatile and unstoppable stunning, which is always a good option. Deathbringer is there, but it is just damage. It doesn't do anything more than that, really. Then, of course, there is Heart Shadow, which is the sword from Duality. It does weaken as well as give you benefits to your invisibility. I would say this is a decent enough option. You just have to be willing to risk running a sword. From that point, there is also Deterministic Chaos, which is going to get a buff, but it definitely sounds like it's going to be not so great come Final Shape. It doesn't sound like they're doing much, considering they're literally just giving it anti-barrier as well as reworking its perks. So literally, the volatile is first and the weakening is second in terms of its occurrences. But from that is all of the weapons I can generally recommend. Of course, if you have any legendary weapons that have destabilizing rounds and repulsor brace, I would never not recommend that for your Void setups. But from that point, that is all of the exotics I can mindfully give recommendations to for Prismatic. I know there is a lot of weapons you can choose from. There has been a handful of good Void exotics recently, and unfortunately, I am sad that on most characters other than Hunter, that there isn't many specific options you can go with, but I hope I can give enough recommendations to use in alternates if you're hoping to take advantage of Void come Prismatic in the Final Shape. With that, my name is TheMadScorpyon, and I will see you in the next video where I cover Solar whenever I actually get around to it.